I bought the 60 acres on a quiet Tuesday morning, the kind of day where nothing dramatic is supposed to happen. The deed was signed, the wire was cleared, and the land was finally mine. Rolling pasture, a line of old oak trees, and a private gravel road that ended at a steel ranch gate I had installed that same afternoon. No HOA signs. No shared amenities. No community pool. Just land, silence, and the promise of peace I had worked years to earn. Or at least, that's what I thought as I drove away with the sun dropping low behind the hills. The gate was simple but solid. Black steel, keypad entry, clearly marked with private property, and no trespassing. I didn't put it up to make enemies. I put it up because the previous owner had dealt with constant shortcut traffic from a nearby HOA that believed convenience trumped property lines. I was told the problem had mostly stopped. Mostly, as I would soon learn, was a lie. 2 days later, I was back on the land early, walking fence lines and planning where the barn would go, when I heard tires crunching fast on gravel. Not slowing, not stopping, charging straight toward the gate. A white SUV slammed to a halt inches from it, horn blaring like I'd personally offended it. The driver's door flew open, and out stepped a woman in her late 50s, HOA confidence radiating off her like static electricity. She didn't introduce herself. She didn't ask who I was. She pointed at the gate and shouted, "This needs to come down. Now." I stayed calm. I always do at first. I explained, politely, that the land was private, newly purchased, and that the gate was legal. I even offered to show her the survey if there was confusion. That's when her face changed. The polite mask slipped, replaced with something sharper, something entitled. "I'm the HOA president," she snapped, like that was a badge and a warrant rolled into one. "This road has been used by our residents for years. You can't just block it." I told her I absolutely could and had. That's when she pulled out her phone and said the words that would set everything in motion. "Fine. I'm calling the police." She dialed 911 while staring at me like she'd already won. Loudly, dramatically, she told the dispatcher that I was blocking community access, threatening residents, and illegally fencing shared land. None of it was true. All of it was said with conviction. As she spoke, more cars began to line up behind her. HOA residents. Curious. Annoyed. Some recording on their phones. I could feel it building, the familiar storm of gossip, authority, and assumption that always seems to gather around people like her. What she didn't know, standing there with her phone pressed to her ear, was that she had just made a catastrophic mistake. Because this wasn't just about a gate. This wasn't just about 60 acres. And this time, the police she called weren't going to play the role she expected. Not even close. By the time the patrol car rolled up, Karen was already rehearsing her performance. She stood by the gate with her arms crossed, chin lifted, phone still in her hand like a badge of authority. The officer stepped out calmly, glanced at the gravel road, the fence line, the clearly posted deed marker, and then at me. Before he could speak, Karen launched in, her voice sharp and practiced, accusing me of illegally blocking community access, claiming the land had always been shared, and insisting I was threatening residents by installing a gate without permission. She talked fast, stacking accusations like bricks, hoping volume would substitute for truth. I stayed quiet. I'd learned long ago that people who lie hate silence more than confrontation. The officer finally raised a hand and asked for documentation. Karen scoffed, saying she didn't need papers because everyone knows the HOA controlled this stretch of land. She gestured vaguely toward the hills, as if ownership could be declared by pointing. I reached into my truck and pulled out the survey, the purchase agreement, and the county-approved access plan. When I handed them over, Karen laughed, loud and dismissive, telling the officer those documents were fake and that she'd already spoken to her lawyer. That confidence cracked slightly when the officer began actually reading. As the minutes passed, Karen's tone shifted. The certainty drained out, replaced by irritation, then unease. The officer asked her for the HOA easement paperwork she claimed existed. She froze. She said it was on file somewhere and accused me of hiding records. The officer explained, patiently but firmly, that easements don't work that way. They're recorded, specific, and enforceable only if they exist in writing. Karen's face reddened. She tried a new angle, claiming emergency access, then historical use, then implied threats about fines and legal action. Each argument collapsed under basic questions. What Karen didn't realize was that this wasn't my first run-in with paperwork bullies. Before buying the land, I'd done what she never expected. I checked everything. Title history, plat maps, old access disputes. There had been an easement decades ago, but it was vacated when the previous owner consolidated parcels. The HOA had been bluffing ever since, relying on intimidation instead of legality. And it had worked until now. The officer handed my documents back and turned to Karen. He told her, clearly, that I was within my rights to install the gate, that the land was private, and that there was no record of any HOA access. He warned her that continuing to interfere could be considered harassment. Karen snapped back that she'd call the police again, that this wasn't over, that the HOA would bury me in court. The officer didn't react. He simply noted the call in his report and suggested she consult an attorney before making further claims. As the patrol car drove away, Karen didn't leave. She stood there staring at the gate like it had personally betrayed her. Then she leaned in close and hissed that I'd made a powerful enemy, that people like me never last in communities like this. I told her, calmly, that communities built on lies don't last at all. That was when she smiled, thin and sharp, and said she already had a meeting scheduled. An emergency HOA meeting. About me. That night, as the sun dropped behind the hills and the gate cast a long shadow across the road, I reviewed an email notification I'd just received. It was an agenda for that so-called emergency meeting. My name was listed 3 times. Violations. Penalties. Forced compliance. Karen thought she was setting a trap. What she didn't know was that every threat she'd just made was about to hand me exactly what I needed. By the time the patrol car rolled up to my gate, the situation had already turned from annoying to surreal. The deputy stepped out slowly, hand resting near his belt, eyes scanning the fence, the fresh lock, and then Karen, who was already mid-rant before he could even greet us. She launched into her story like it was rehearsed, claiming I had illegally blocked a community access route, that emergency vehicles would be endangered, and that I was a repeat offender who had been warned multiple times. The deputy listened politely, nodding, then finally turned to me and asked a single calm question. "Sir, do you own this property?" I handed him the folded deed from my truck's glove box, already expecting this moment. He studied it longer than I expected, walked closer to the gate, checked the parcel number against his tablet, and then frowned slightly. Karen mistook that frown for victory. She smirked, folded her arms, and loudly announced that she would be pressing charges and calling the HOA's attorney next. What she didn't realize was that the frown wasn't about the gate. It was about her. The deputy looked up and asked Karen if she was aware that the road she was claiming as an easement had been legally abandoned by the county 12 years earlier. Her face froze. She laughed nervously and said that was impossible because the HOA has always used it. He explained, slowly and clearly, that habitual use doesn't override recorded land law. The easement had expired, was never renewed, and the land reverted fully to the property owner, me. The gate, lock, and fencing were completely lawful. Karen's tone changed instantly. She shifted from aggressive to indignant, accusing me of tricking her, accusing the county of corruption, accusing the deputy of favoritism. When that didn't work, she tried intimidation. She reminded him that she was the HOA president, that she worked closely with local officials, and that this wasn't going to end well. That was when the deputy did something unexpected. He asked for her ID. The air felt heavier as she handed it over. He stepped aside, radioed in, and waited. Karen paced, muttering under her breath, shooting me looks that promised revenge. I just leaned against my truck, letting the silence do the work. A few minutes later, the deputy came back, expression firm. He informed Karen that filing a false police report was a misdemeanor and that this was the third complaint involving her name and property disputes in the last 6 months. That's when the crowd arrived. 2 HOA board members pulled up, clearly summoned by Karen's frantic texts. They expected to see me being lectured or arrested. Instead, they saw their president being warned. The deputy explained the situation again, this time with witnesses. He clarified that any further attempts to access my land without permission would constitute trespassing and that enforcement would be immediate. The real turning point came when one board member quietly asked to see the deed too. I handed it over. He read it, then looked at Karen, not with anger, but with something worse, doubt. That doubt spread. Questions started forming. Why hadn't she told them the easement expired? Why was she collecting maintenance fees for a road they didn't legally control? Why were legal threats being issued without verification? Karen realized too late that calling the police hadn't strengthened her authority, it had exposed it. The gate stood closed behind me, solid and legal, while her grip on power began to crack in front of everyone. By the time the patrol cars rolled up to my gate, the situation had already shifted in ways Karen didn't yet understand. She stood there with her arms crossed, chin lifted, rehearsing the same lines she'd been using for years. Illegal gate, blocked access, HOA authority. I could see it in her posture. She expected compliance, apologies, maybe even handcuffs on me. What she didn't expect was recognition. The first deputy stepped out of his cruiser, looked from the gate to me, and paused. His eyes narrowed slightly, not in suspicion, but in confusion. Then it clicked. His shoulders relaxed, and he gave a short nod. "Evening," he said, addressing me first. That single word shifted the balance of power more than any argument ever could. Karen immediately jumped in, talking over him, waving HOA documents she'd printed that morning. She explained how she'd ruled this area for years, how residents answered to her, how this gate violated HOA bylaws she personally enforced. The deputy listened politely, but his gaze kept drifting back to the survey markers, the posted property signs, and the chain secured exactly where the legal boundary ended. Another cruiser arrived. Then another. Officers stepped out, some younger, some veterans. One of them smiled when he saw me, a quick grin Karen completely missed. The party atmosphere from earlier still lingered in the air, music faint in the distance, string lights glowing behind the house. This wasn't the hostile takeover she'd imagined. This was a reckoning. When the deputies finally asked for documentation, Karen thrust her binder forward with dramatic flair. HOA maps, photocopied bylaws, handwritten notes in the margins. She spoke confidently, almost smugly, as if volume alone could bend reality. I waited. I'd learned long ago that letting people talk themselves into a corner was more effective than interrupting them. When she finished, I handed over my folder. Clean surveys, county records, recorded deeds, court filings from the land purchase. The silence that followed was heavy. One deputy flipped through the pages slowly. Another walked the line of the fence, checking markers against GPS. Karen's confidence began to leak away, replaced by irritation, then unease. She tried to regain control by changing tactics. She accused me of intimidation, of throwing parties to influence law enforcement. She even suggested corruption, implying the officers were biased because they knew me. That was the moment things truly unraveled for her. The lead deputy straightened, his tone firm but calm, and explained that false claims against officers were serious. Very serious. He clarified that the gate was entirely on my land, legally purchased, legally surveyed, and entirely outside HOA jurisdiction. No easement. No shared access. No authority. Each sentence landed like a hammer. Karen's face flushed, then paled. She opened her mouth to argue again, but nothing came out. The deputy then asked her a simple question. Did she have permission to be on this property? Karen froze. She looked around as if expecting someone to back her up, but the crowd was gone. The officers were waiting. I was waiting. The answer, of course, was no. She'd spent years assuming access equaled ownership, authority equaled law. Now, confronted with reality, she had none of it. The deputy explained that continued interference could be considered harassment, and that attempting to control land outside HOA boundaries was not just unethical, but actionable. Karen's reign, built on fear, bluster, and unchecked power, was collapsing in real time. As the officers prepared to leave, one of them quietly advised Karen to consult an attorney before making any more calls like this. Another reminded her not to return without permission. She stood there, speechless, clutching her useless binder. The gate remained closed. The land remained mine. And for the first time since I bought those 60 acres, the message was unmistakably clear. Her authority ended here. By the time the sun dipped low behind the tree line, the power balance on that land had shifted completely, and everyone present knew it. The deputy finished his call, slid his phone back onto his belt, and looked directly at Karen. His voice was calm, but final. There would be no citations for me, no forced gate removal, no temporary access granted to the HOA. Instead, there would be an official report documenting harassment, false police reports, and attempted intimidation by an HOA officer acting outside her authority. Karen's face drained of color as the weight of that realization settled in. I didn't raise my voice. I didn't need to. I simply explained, clearly and methodically, that the gate complied with county code, that the road was private, and that any further attempts to interfere with my property would be handled through my attorney. I also informed her, politely, that I would be filing a formal complaint with the HOA board, attaching the police report, body cam footage, and written statements from the neighbors who had gathered by then. The word forever hadn't been spoken yet, but it was hanging in the air. The neighbors were no longer whispering. They were openly discussing how often Karen had pulled stunts like this, how she'd threatened fines, fabricated violations, and used police involvement as a scare tactic for years. One by one, stories spilled out. The deputy listened. The second officer took notes. Karen tried to interrupt, but no one gave her the floor anymore. Authority had quietly moved away from her, and she couldn't claw it back. Within a week, the consequences became very real. The HOA board called an emergency meeting. Karen was suspended pending investigation. 2 weeks later, she was removed entirely after the board reviewed the evidence and legal exposure she had created. The HOA's attorney made it clear her actions had put them at risk of lawsuits they would absolutely lose. Her reign didn't end with drama. It ended with paperwork, votes, and a unanimous decision. As for the gate, it stayed right where it was. I upgraded it, installed cameras, and added clear signage marking the boundary. No one challenged it again. The same neighbors who once avoided eye contact now stopped by to thank me. Some admitted they'd been scared to speak up before. Others said they finally felt like the HOA worked for the residents again, not against them. Karen never apologized. She didn't need to. The silence after her removal said more than words ever could. No more threatening letters. No more patrol cars showing up over imaginary violations. Just peace, quiet, and a clear understanding of where authority truly belonged. I bought that land for privacy, freedom, and control over my own life. What I didn't expect was to become the turning point that ended years of abuse disguised as governance. All it took was one gate, one phone call that backfired, and the truth written down by people who couldn't be bullied. Karen thought calling the police would put me in my place. Instead, it exposed hers. And once that happened, her power didn't just weaken. It disappeared for good.